There are things that exist quietly inside us, things we carry without knowing their name or their weight. Things that science has touched but never fully grasped. Things that ancient memory has wrapped in stories we call myth, because we do not yet have a better word for them. Tonight, we will follow a very old thread. It runs through your blood, perhaps literally, and through the blood of every human being who has ever stood under this sky and wondered what they truly are, where they came from, and whether the distance between themselves and the rest of the world is a wound or a gift. We will move slowly. There is no destination tonight, only a deepening. The first layer of our journey rests on hard scientific ground, on genetics and molecular biology, and the quiet, almost embarrassed admissions of researchers who found something they could not fully explain. The second layer is older, woven from the threads of ancient texts and the oral memories of peoples who lived at the edge of the known world. And the third is simply the question itself, held gently in the dark, turned in the hands like a stone worn smooth by a river whose source no one has found. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around a mystery written not in stone or papyrus, but in the quiet architecture of your own cells. If something in these words finds an echo in you, trust that feeling. It knows the way. Allow your body to settle now. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders, from the small places where tension gathers without being invited. Let the breath slow, not by force, but by permission. You are only required to be here, breathing in the dark, while we open the archive together. There is a question that arrives in the small hours, when the practical world has gone temporarily silent, and the mind loosens its grip on the known and brushes, for just a moment, against the edges of what it cannot explain. It is not a question about power or survival or the mechanics of the physical world. It is quieter than those questions, and stranger, and more persistent. The question is this: are we from here? Not from this country, or this city, or this century, but from here, from this planet, from this particular branch of the tree of life that grew in the direction of self-awareness and curiosity and the capacity to wonder about its own origins. Or is there something in us that carries the memory of a different arrangement, a different belonging? Something that the blood remembers even when the mind does not. Tonight we approach this question through a very specific door, through a protein, or rather, through the absence of a protein, a small, precise deletion in the human genome that most primates carry intact, that affects roughly 6% of all human beings alive today, and that after more than 8 decades of intensive scientific investigation remains functionally unexplained. We begin there, in the laboratory, in the language of genes and antigens and blood incompatibilities, with researchers who were trying to solve a clinical problem and found, waiting for them inside it, a philosophical one. We begin somewhere in a laboratory in Los Angeles, in the year 1940. 2 men were studying the blood of a rhesus macaque, a small, curious primate with amber eyes and an ancient face, when they noticed something they had not expected to find. A protein on the surface of the monkey's red blood cells behaved like a key, fitting precisely into the lock of the human immune system. When they introduced this protein to human blood, the blood recognized it. It remembered it in the way the immune system remembers threats. And when they looked closely at the human samples before them, they found that most people, the great majority, carried this same protein already, as if something deep in our ancestry had already met this molecule, had already reached an agreement with it across the slow corridors of evolutionary time. They called it the RH factor, after the rhesus monkey. Dr. Karl Landsteiner and his colleague Alexander Wiener published their findings with the measured calm of scientists who believed they had solved a clinical problem, not opened a philosophical one. And in the narrow clinical sense, they had, while the other problem, the stranger and more durable one, waited quietly in the data for someone to look at it in a different light. The clinical problem was this: when a woman who lacked this protein, who was, in the language of medicine, Rh negative, carried a child who possessed it, her immune system could turn against her own pregnancy. Her blood, encountering the child's foreign protein across the fragile boundary of the placenta, would begin building defenses against it. In a first pregnancy, this immune response was rarely severe enough to cause harm. But in a second pregnancy, in a third, the accumulated memory of the mother's immune system could become something more dangerous than a defense. It could become a siege. The mother's accumulated immunological memory turning against the blood of the child who had inherited its Rh-positive status from its father, recognizing it not as a continuation of herself, but as something foreign, something that did not belong, something the body had decided, with the cold precision of ancient biological instruction, to destroy. This condition, called hemolytic disease of the newborn, killed children. It caused severe anemia, jaundice, damage to the developing brain, and in the most serious cases, stillbirth. Before the development of preventive treatment in the 1960s and 70s, a remarkable medical achievement that reduced its incidence by more than 90%. It was a real and recurring tragedy in families where the incompatibility ran. Modern medicine has largely contained its consequences, which is remarkable. But the deeper question, why it existed at all, why a trait so costly to reproduction persists in the human genome across tens of thousands of years, that question has not been resolved. This is the first strange fact, and it bears sitting with in the comfortable darkness. There is a subset of human beings whose bodies, when carrying life, treat that life as a foreign invader, not out of pathology, not out of failure, but because the blood of the child carries a protein that the mother's blood genuinely, accurately, does not recognize as its own. They are, in a precise immunological sense, from different populations of a kind that the immune system, with its ancient, literal, unsentimentally accurate memory, has not forgotten. Evolution is not sentimental either. It doesn't preserve traits that kill children unless something else, something not yet named, makes those traits worth keeping. And yet here we are, thousands of years into human history, and roughly 6 to 7% of all people on Earth are Rh negative. The deletion, not an addition, not a new protein, but an absence, a missing piece of code that most primates carry intact, persists. It has not been selected out. In certain populations, it has flourished. Something was worth it. And what that something was, science, after 80 years of careful looking, has not yet been able to say. The molecular story is worth understanding in its actual detail, because the detail is more interesting than the summary. Most mammals have a single Rh gene. During the evolution of primates, this gene duplicated, producing two closely related genes, what we now call RHCE and RHD. Both genes code for proteins that sit on the surface of red blood cells. The RHCE protein is present in essentially all humans. The RHD protein, the one that determines your positive or negative status, the one that causes maternal-fetal incompatibility when it is present in a fetus and absent in the mother, underwent a deletion event in an ancestral hominid population sometime during the past 100,000 years. The deletion was not a catastrophic mutation. It was a precise genomic event that removed one of the two gene copies that primates had been carrying for millions of years. Researchers now estimate that this deletion first appeared somewhere in Africa, carried by a small founding population, perhaps 100,000 or more years ago. At that time and in that place, the deletion would have been exceedingly rare. Yet as populations moved, as the great human migrations unfolded across the face of the planet, as some groups contracted and others expanded, and some became isolated behind mountain ranges or coastlines or cultural barriers, the deletion did not disappear. It moved with the people who carried it, concentrated in certain places as populations, contracted and isolated, and became, in the westernmost corner of Europe, the characteristic genetic signature of the most ancient and isolated population on the continent. In the Basque Country, that ancient borderland between what we now call France and Spain, pressed against the western edge of the Pyrenees, where the mountains fall toward the Atlantic, the frequency of Art-negative blood rises to somewhere between 22 and 47%, depending on the community and the method of measurement. In some isolated valleys and remote coastal settlements, historical estimates from mid-20th century serological studies placed it even higher. Scientific literature on the subject notes, with evident puzzlement, that this rate is not just the highest in Europe, but the highest recorded in any human population anywhere on Earth. The Basques hold this distinction without apparent awareness of its strangeness, the way an old family might hold a peculiar heirloom without remembering where it came from. The Basques, a people who speak a language unrelated to any other living language on Earth, whose linguistic roots predate the great Indo-European expansion that swept across Europe roughly 5,000 years ago, who show genetic markers connecting them to the hunter-gatherers of the European Upper Paleolithic, carry this absence at a rate that has no parallel anywhere in the world. Genome-wide studies published in the first decades of the 21st century have confirmed and refined this picture. The Basques appear to have undergone genetic isolation from their European neighbors sometime in the Iron Age, perhaps 3,000 years ago, preserving an earlier genetic signature at unusually high frequency, while their neighbors mixed with successive waves of incoming populations from the east and south and north. In East Asia, in contrast, the picture inverts itself with startling completeness. Fewer than 1% of people in Japan carry Rh-negative blood. In China and Korea, the figure is similarly close to nothing. Among indigenous populations of the Americas and Oceania, people whose ancestors left Africa and eventually crossed into Asia and beyond long before the Rh-negative deletion appears to have reached high frequency in Europe. The frequency is, in most populations, essentially zero. This is not a minor statistical variation. This is a map with a center and an edge, and the center is in Western Europe, and it fades as you move outward in almost any direction, until in much of the world it vanishes almost entirely into the background noise of random mutation. Scientists have tried to explain this distribution through the standard vocabulary of population genetics. Genetic drift, the random amplification of a rare trait in a small, isolated population over a very long time. A founder effect, in which the ancestors of the Basques carried this trait at higher than average frequencies when they became isolated, and their long isolation preserved and perhaps amplified it. And, more speculatively, a selective advantage. Some unknown benefit of carrying the deleted RHD gene that partially offsets the very real reproductive cost of pregnancies ending in immune conflict. None of these hypotheses has been decisively confirmed. All of them may contain partial truths. The full answer, whatever it is, has not yet been assembled. That last possibility, the selective advantage, is where the science becomes genuinely strange. In the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers investigating the distribution of Rh-negative blood noticed an unexpected correlation in the epidemiological data. Populations with higher frequencies of Rh-negative blood tended to also live in regions with higher historical prevalence of Toxoplasma gondii, one of the most ubiquitous parasites in the world. Toxoplasma is carried primarily by cats and spread through contaminated soil, water, and undercooked meat. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all living human beings carry latent Toxoplasma infections, most entirely unaware of it. The hypothesis that emerged from this observation was careful and provisional. Perhaps the deletion in the Rhd gene, which removes a protein of unknown function from the surface of red blood cells, also removes something that Toxoplasma uses to identify, enter, or manipulate those cells. If Rh-negative individuals were, in some measurable way, more resistant to Toxoplasma infection or its effects, this resistance could have provided a selective advantage large enough to counterbalance the disadvantage of maternal-fetal incompatibility. The trait would have been preserved not despite its costs, but because its benefits, in a world where Toxoplasma was everywhere, were significant enough to matter. This remains an unproven hypothesis, but it is the most scientifically coherent explanation currently on the table for a genetic peculiarity that has been waiting for an explanation for more than 80 years. And it raises a question that is not purely scientific. What else might the Rhd protein do? What other interactions, what other negotiations with the microbial and parasitic world might this single protein be involved in? Negotiations whose significance we have not yet thought to look for. Because here is the deepest puzzle at the center of the whole investigation. The Rhd protein, the protein that Rh-negative people do not have, has been intensively studied for 8 decades. It is clinically crucial, and the entire infrastructure of blood banking and transfusion medicine is built around it. And yet, its actual biological function, what it does for the cell, what role it plays in the normal life of the body, what the organism uses it for, is unknown. Researchers have speculated about carbon dioxide transport and oxygen exchange and ammonia processing. A closely related protein does transport ammonium, but Rhd itself has not yielded its function. The protein sits on the red blood cell membrane, clearly doing something, and after 8 decades of investigation, the something has not been named. This is where the science arrives, after 80 years of careful investigation, and stops. Not at an answer, but at a shape. The shape of something that has been preserved for reasons unknown, distributed in a pattern that implies a story we have not yet told, pointing toward a function we have not yet named. The cold arithmetic of natural selection says clearly that something was worth the cost. What that something was remains, as of tonight, unwritten. There is one more dimension of the scientific picture that deserves attention before we leave it behind, because it touches on something that the purely molecular story does not fully convey. The Rh-negative trait, wherever it appears in the world, appears with a particular geographic logic that goes beyond the European concentration. In the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, among certain Berber populations who have lived in those high valleys since before the historical record begins, Rh-negative frequencies reach levels comparable to some European populations, well above the global average, and striking in their contrast to the sub-Saharan African average of 1 to 3%. In certain populations of the Canary Islands, the same pattern appears. The Canary Islands are the westernmost extension of the African continent, closer to Morocco than to the nearest European coast, and their pre-colonial inhabitants, the Guanches, left behind a genetic and archaeological record that does not fit neatly into any known migration model. These are the geographic fingerprints of the mystery as the science currently maps it. Not a single event, not a single population, not a single migration corridor, but a pattern that recurs in places that shared something. A climate, a landscape, a way of living at the edge of the inhabitable world. During an ice age that ended 12,000 years ago and reshaped the planet's coastlines, submerging land bridges and drowning the coastal settlements of a human population that was, by the time the ice retreated, already old. We do not know what those drowned settlements contained, who lived in them, what they believed, what they knew, or what they carried in their blood. The sea took the evidence, and the genes, carried in the bodies of those who moved to higher ground in time, were all that remained. In 1912, in a limestone cave near the town of Lascaux in the Dordogne Valley of France, not far, geographically and in terms of genetic lineage, from the Basque heartland to the south, someone mixed red ochre and manganese dioxide and set their hand against the stone wall and drew a horse. The line was made by a mind that possessed language and memory, and the capacity to represent a living thing on a surface that was not alive. That mind, moving in the orange light of a fat-burning lamp, looking at what it had made, may have been contemplating something we would recognize as art and as the particular solitude of making it. That person carried in their body the deletion we have been discussing. Their descendants, by one possible reading of the genetic evidence, are alive today in the mountains above the Bay of Biscay, speaking a language no one else speaks, carrying an absence in their blood that 80 years of science has not been able to explain. The laboratory has given us what it can tonight. We carry its question, solid, unanswered, quietly luminous. As we move now into older waters where the unit of meaning is not the data point, but the story, where what cannot be proven is still sometimes true in the only way that finally matters, in the body, in the dark, in the place where the questions live. Before there were geneticists, there were storytellers. And before there were storytellers, there were the stories themselves. Moving through populations the way certain traits move, carried not in cells, but in the architecture of memory, passed from mouth to ear across the slow centuries, accumulating the weight of repetition until they became the kind of truth that does not require evidence, because they have become something deeper than evidence. Felt knowledge. Knowledge that lives not in the reasoning mind, but in the body that hears it, and simply, without argument, recognizes. In the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, embedded in the founding narrative of the world's 3 largest religions, there is a passage that has troubled scholars, theologians, and dreamers in roughly equal measure for 2,500 years. It reads, in its most direct translation, something like this: There were Nephilim on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root meaning to fall, the fallen ones, or in another reading that scholars have argued over across centuries, those who cause others to fall. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria sometime in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, rendered the word simply as giants, which is how most people have encountered it. But the original term is stranger and more resonant than that single word conveys, pointing to something that was not merely large, but the product of a crossing of boundaries that was not supposed to happen, a mingling of what the ancient text regarded as fundamentally different orders of being. The Book of Enoch, a text that was once widely circulated among early Jewish and Christian communities, but was eventually declared apocryphal, set aside, hidden, not quite canonical, too strange to fit comfortably inside the edifice of established doctrine, expands on this passage in remarkable detail. In Enoch's telling, the Watchers were a specific order of beings who looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and who chose to descend, to cross the membrane between whatever they were and whatever humans were, and to take human partners, whose children, enormous and strange, possessing abilities that ordinary humans did not possess, foreknowledge, the capacity to affect the weather, a kind of power that the text describes as terrifying to ordinary people. The Book of Enoch was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the remarkable library of a Jewish community living at Qumran in the Judean desert, sealed in clay jars and hidden in the cliffside caves above the Dead Sea sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era, and undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years until a Bedouin shepherd, looking for a lost goat, threw a stone into a cave in 1947 and heard it strike something that was not stone. The text was quoted as authoritative by early Christian writers, Justin Martyr, Origen, Tertullian, men of considerable theological gravity, before a later generation of church authorities decided it was too strange, too dangerous, too difficult to reconcile with the simpler cosmology they were trying to consolidate, and quietly moved it to the margins of acceptable scripture. What makes this act of marginalization interesting from the perspective of our evening's investigation is that the text itself appears to have anticipated it. The Book of Enoch contains within it what reads like a forward address to a future generation. These words are not for this generation, but for a remote one that is to come. It is as if the author, whoever they were, writing in the centuries before the Common Era, from sources that appear to be considerably older, knew that what they were saying would not be welcome in their own time, and was speaking past it into a darkness that would eventually lighten. The connection between Nephilim bloodlines and Rh-negative blood is not a claim made by archaeologists or academic geneticists. It lives in the border territory between alternative history, spiritual tradition, and the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that is very human and very ancient and not always wrong. It circulates in communities of people who feel, with some intensity, that their blood type marks them as different, not superior, not chosen in any comfortable theological sense, but other, and who have reached back through the available mythological record for a language in which to express that feeling. Whether the feeling is accurate, whether it corresponds to any actual external reality, is a question we are not able to answer tonight. What we can observe is that the feeling is widespread enough, persistent enough, and specific enough in its imagery to deserve attention as a phenomenon in its own right. What the mythology offers is not proof. What it offers is something older than proof. The image of a crossing, of an inheritance that came from somewhere unexpected, of children who did not quite fit the world they were born into. Whether the Nephilim were literal beings, metaphorical constructs, the distorted echo of genuine encounters between modern humans and archaic hominids whose biology we have not fully mapped, or something else entirely. None of that is recoverable from this distance. But the story itself, the shape of it, has a persistence that is worth noticing. It appears in Genesis and in Enoch and in the Book of Jubilees, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Quran's references to the people of Ad, enormous beings who rejected divine messengers and were destroyed. In the Sats, Sumerian cuneiform records of the Anunnaki, the offspring of the sky god Anu. divine beings who descended from their celestial sphere to interact with humanity, who appear in tablets that predate the Hebrew scriptures by at least 1,000 years. It appears in the Greek myths of the Titans, in the stories of Hercules and Achilles and Perseus, heroes born between divine fathers and mortal mothers, possessing capabilities that set them apart from ordinary humanity and that made their lives, almost without exception, both extraordinary and painful. They did not quite fit. Too much of one world and not enough of the other, their blood carrying the memory of both. These stories do not prove a genetic origin for Rh-negative blood. They do not constitute evidence in any scientific sense of the word. But they map, with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no documented contact with one another, the same essential shape, a lineage that came partly from elsewhere, children who carried something in them that was not entirely of the world they walked in. Beings with strangeness, with a difference that was noticed and named and placed, again and again and again, in culture after culture, at the very center of origin stories, not as a footnote, but as the central tension. There is a different kind of legend that attaches to the Basques specifically, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. The Basques themselves, or at least the traditions preserved in their oral culture, in the stories that were told in the Pyrenean villages before the world became loud enough to drown them out, do not speak of Nephilim. They speak of the Basa Jaun, the lord of the forest, a great wild being, covered in long hair, neither quite human nor quite animal, who dwelled in the deep forests of the Pyrenean heights and who was, according to some traditions, the original teacher of humanity. It was the Basa Jaun who first showed humans how to smelt metal. It was the Basa Jaun who first revealed the techniques of milling grain. It was the Basa Jaun who taught the arts that lifted human life out of pure survival and into something that deserved to be called civilization. He was feared and respected in equal measure. He was encountered at the edge of things, at the boundary between the settled and the wild, between the village and the mountain, between the known and the not known. He was the guardian of a threshold. And then, gradually, as the centuries passed and the forests retreated and the mountains were mapped and the old ways were replaced by newer and louder ones, the Basa Jaun became a figure in folklore rather than in living belief. He moved from the edge of the world to the edge of memory. But he did not entirely disappear, which is what old things do when they are true at some level that ordinary time cannot touch. There is a thread that runs through the oldest mythologies of the Atlantic world, from the Basque Mountains west across the ocean to the far shores of the Americas, that describes, in its various forms, the same essential figure, a being who came from the sea, who carried knowledge that the local people did not yet possess, who taught the arts of civilization and the mysteries of the sky, and who eventually departed or dissolved back into the water, leaving behind only the memory and the gifts. The Mesoamerican figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the bringer of the calendar and the knowledge of seeds, is sometimes described in the oldest accounts as arriving from across the eastern water, from the direction of the rising sun. The Andean tradition of Viracocha carries similar imagery. A creator and teacher who walked among the first people, instructed them in everything they needed to survive, and then walked into the ocean toward the setting sun, not drowning, but simply continuing in a direction that had no return. These are distant echoes, refracted through centuries of retelling and the inevitable distortions of oral transmission across long time. But the shape beneath the echoes, the arrival from elsewhere, the gift of knowledge, the departure that was not a death, is consistent enough across cultures with no documented contact that it deserves at least the question of what it might be preserving. We are in the territory of legend now, and legend has its own rules. It does not demand that you believe it. It asks only that you hold it, that you allow the image to form, to breathe, to cast its particular quality of light on the question you brought with you into the dark. The image is this: a lineage that crossed a boundary, blood that carries the memory of a crossing, a protein whose absence, after 80 years of research, still has no explanation. An ancient people speaking an unrelated language, living in the mountains at the edge of the known world, carrying that absence at a rate that no other population on Earth approaches. There is a version of this story that involves Atlantis, and it deserves a few sentences. Not because it is provable, but because the geography is interesting in a way that is hard to dismiss entirely. Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, describes a great island civilization that lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Beyond what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Europe and Africa where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. Atlantis was, in Plato's account, the origin of a tradition of knowledge that was preserved in Egypt and transmitted to Solon and through Solon to the Greek world. The civilization was destroyed in a single day and night by catastrophic flooding, and its survivors dispersed into the surrounding world, becoming the ancestors of peoples who did not remember, or who remembered only in garbled form, what they had. You reach if you pass through that door. The Strait of Gibraltar is the door between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The Basque coast is among the first landmasses you reach if you pass through that door heading north. Whether this geographical proximity means anything, whether the Basques are the survivors of anything, whether Atlantis was a real place or a philosophical parable that Plato constructed to make an argument about political hubris, these questions are unanswerable with current evidence. But the shape of the story, the surviving remnant, carrying irreplaceable knowledge and irreplaceable blood from a world that no longer exists, maps onto the facts of Basque genetic uniqueness with a precision that is not nothing, even if it is not proof. What we know for certain is only this: there is a population at the far western edge of Europe, older than agriculture in the genetic sense, speaking an untranslatable language, carrying an unexplained blood marker at a frequency the rest of the world does not approach, whose genetic trail vanishes into the last ice age with no clear antecedent anywhere in the old world. They are, in a very literal genetic sense, a mystery. They live in the mountains and fish in the sea and play their ancient games and speak their untranslatable words, and their blood carries its quiet anomaly forward into the future with the patience of something that has been here longer than the concept of history. The old stories do not know what science knows, and science does not know what the old stories know. Between them lies the space where tonight's question lives, in the gap where neither vocabulary is quite adequate, where fact and image briefly become the same thing. Not the mechanism, but the meaning. Not the gene, but the weight. All of it. The protein, the deletion, the map of its strange distribution, the ancient texts, the untranslatable language in its Pyrenean mountains, all of it has been circling a single question. The question that arrives quietly at 3 a.m, the one that has no season, no resolution, no final answer that holds. The question of belonging, of whether we, as a species, are truly at home here, and whether the distance some of us feel between ourselves and the world is a wound to be healed, or a signal to be understood. The Gnostics believed the soul was a spark of divine light imprisoned in matter, a fragment of a higher reality trying to remember its origin through the interference of a world that was not, fundamentally, the soul's home. Not lost, but exiled. An intelligence placed inside a body on a planet that did not entirely suit it, trying to find its way back to something it had almost forgotten the name of. The Orphic tradition in ancient Greece spoke of the soul as a traveler, fallen from the stars, working its way through successive incarnations toward a luminosity it had once possessed and lost. There is a fragment attributed to the Orphic tablets, thin gold leaves placed in graves across the ancient Mediterranean world, inscribed with instructions for the journey of the soul after death. That says something extraordinary. I am a child of earth and of starry heaven. My race is of heaven. This is a simple sentence that has been waiting in its gold leaf for 2,000 years to be read. My race is of heaven. Not my soul, not my aspiration, not my hope, but my race itself, my lineage, the thing that was passed down to me through blood. The Vedic tradition of ancient India conceived of the Atman, the innermost self, the awareness behind awareness, as something that existed prior to and beyond any particular incarnation, woven into the fabric of a reality so large and so unified that the appearance of separateness, the experience of being a distinct individual in a world of other distinct individuals, was understood as a kind of temporary and educational illusion, not a mistake, but a prolonged encounter with limitation that was designed, at some level, to teach the unlimited something about itself. These traditions do not agree on the details. They agree on the shape, that there is something in us which is not entirely of here. That consciousness, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, feels, at its most honest moments, like a visitor wearing a very convincing disguise. That the longing for something we cannot name, the homesickness for a place we have never been, the recognition of something familiar in music or in mathematics or in the silence after a question well asked. These are not pathologies, not symptoms of something that needs to be corrected. They are, perhaps, the most honest data available. The Rh negative mystery invites us to hold this question not abstractly, but in the body, in the blood, in the molecular fact of an absence that science cannot explain, and that ancient memory encoded in the language of fallen angels, and blood that did not mix, and children who did not quite belong. What if the question of whether we belong here is not merely metaphysical? What if it has a biological dimension, not in the crude sense of a separate species, not as the basis for any hierarchy or any claim of superiority, but in the subtler sense of a lineage that has always been slightly apart, that has always carried, quite literally in its cells, a marker of difference whose meaning has not yet been decoded? There is something worth considering about the nature of Rh-negative blood in its medical context, approached not as a clinical problem, but as a philosophical image. The kind of image that the tradition of deep meaning has always used to carry truths that are too large for argument. The Rh-negative person can give blood to anyone who shares their blood group designation. But the O-negative individual, the rarest and most universal, can give their blood to every human being on Earth, regardless of type. They are the universal donor. Their blood carries the fewest surface markers, which presents the smallest possible immunological target to a recipient's defenses, can flow into any body and be received without attack, without rejection, without the intricate negotiation of compatibility that all other blood types require. And yet, the O-negative person can receive blood only from other O-negative donors. They are configured for giving and cannot easily take. They offer a universality that they themselves cannot access. They stand at a kind of center, available to everyone, unreachable by most, that is both a gift and a particular form of solitude. This is a metaphor, obviously, and metaphors are not arguments. But metaphors, in the tradition we are working in tonight, the tradition of the archive of deep meaning, are instruments for holding what cannot otherwise be held. The image of a blood that gives universally and cannot easily receive rhymes with something that many people describe regardless of their blood type. A sense of being constitutionally oriented toward giving, toward being useful, toward being available to others, while finding it genuinely difficult to receive, to ask, to be held in return. Whether this experience is more common among Rh-negative individuals is not something that has been systematically studied, and we are not claiming that it is. We are noting that the image is vivid and that it illuminates something about the particular texture of feeling different, not worse, not better, but differently configured. That the Rh-negative story has always attracted. We do not know what we are. This is perhaps the most important sentence of the evening, and it deserves to settle into the room without hurry. We do not know what consciousness is. We do not know where it comes from. We do not know how it arises from the biological machinery of the brain, or whether it arises from it in the way that water arises from hydrogen and oxygen, a property of combination that was not a property of the parts, or whether consciousness is something else entirely, something that matter participates in without generating. The way a window does not generate sunlight, but lets it through. We do not know what the RHD protein does in the bodies of the 94% of humans who carry it. We do not know why the 6% who lack it have persisted against the evolutionary pressure of pregnancies in immune conflict for 30 to 100,000 years. We do not know why the Basques speak a language with no living relatives anywhere in the world. We do not know what the first artists who painted animals on the walls of the Chauvet cave in southern France, paintings so sophisticated and so vivid that they were initially dismissed as forgeries because no one could believe that human beings 36,000 years ago were capable of them, believed about themselves, about the animals they depicted, about the darkness they moved through with their small oil lamps, about the hands they pressed against the stone and then outlined with blown pigment in an act that is so clearly an assertion of presence, of existence, of the simple, irrefutable fact of being here, that it needs no translation across the 36,000 years that separate their hands from ours. What we know is only this, that the question has been present the entire time, that in every era, in every tradition, in every cultural complex from the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia to the painted caves of Ice Age Europe, to the mountain pastures of the Basque country, human beings have been trying to answer the same question. Not the clinical question, not the genetic question, but the question that contains all other questions. The one that arrives quietly at 3 a.m. with something that feels like grief for a place you have never been. What are we? And where did we come from? And is this planet, this extraordinary, improbable, heartbreakingly beautiful planet, our home? Or are we something that arrived here and has been trying, with the greatest possible tenderness and the most persistent ingenuity, to belong? The philosopher Simone Weil, writing in the 1940s as Europe was destroying itself, described what she called the need for roots as one of the most important and most neglected needs of the human soul. She was writing about social and cultural uprootedness, about the disorientation of populations torn from their communities and their histories. But her words find a resonance that extends beyond the social. To be rooted, she wrote, is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. A human being has roots by virtue of real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past, what Does it mean to carry a genetic signature whose origin was before human memory began? Before the first cities? Before the first written word? Before anything we have agreed to call civilization? What are the roots of a people whose language has no relatives and whose blood carries an unexplained absence that predates agriculture? The Basques have roots, very deep roots, but they are roots that extend into a ground that no map has charted, into a past that the usual tools of historical investigation cannot reach. They are rooted in something that is older than the concept of roots. There is a theory in complexity science, not proven, but suggestive in ways that reward contemplation, that living systems tend to preserve information that has been costly to generate, that genetic structures which took a very long time to appear under conditions that no longer exist are not easily lost because the organism does not know that the conditions have changed and keeps maintaining a capacity whose original context has dissolved. If that principle applies here, if the absence at the center of Rh-negative blood is a record of something very old and very costly and not yet understood, then what we carry in our blood is not merely a medical fact, but an archive, a form of memory in the most literal biological sense, a message from a past that we have not yet learned to read, maintained by the faithful machinery of cellular replication through every generation since whatever event first wrote it. We are, all of us, repositories of things we do not understand. And this is not a limitation. It is perhaps the most precise description of what it means to be alive. To be the carrier of a signal whose full meaning has not yet arrived. The body knows things the mind has not caught up with. The blood remembers what the century does not yet have language for. The cells replicate patterns whose origin is in conditions so ancient that no living human carries a conscious memory of them. And yet they persist, and we are their vehicle, and something in us, in the oldest part of us, in the part that existed before language, before self-consciousness, before the elaborate architecture of civilization built itself over the original simplicity of breathing and moving and being here. Something in us knows this. There is a word in Welsh, hiraeth, that has no direct English equivalent, and that every attempt to translate somehow loses something essential. It means something like longing for a home that either cannot be returned to or may never have existed in exactly the way it is remembered. It carries within it the sorrow of homesickness for a place that exists more clearly in the feeling than in any geography you could point to on a map. Hiraeth is not sadness exactly. It is more like the ache of recognition, the recognition of something that was yours and is no longer yours, or that has always been, always yours, and has not yet been found. It is the feeling that arrives when a piece of music does something to you that you did not expect and cannot explain. It is the feeling that certain landscapes, certain qualities of light, certain arrangements of silence and sound produce in you without your permission, without any obvious reason, with a force and a specificity that exceed what the sensory data alone can account for. If you feel something like hiraeth when you contemplate the oldest questions, the ones about origin and belonging and whether this improbable planet is truly home, that feeling is not a malfunction. It is not nostalgia in the trivial sense. It is, perhaps, the most honest response available to a consciousness that knows, at some level below language, that it is something extraordinary, living inside something ordinary, something ancient, moving through something new, something that has been traveling for a very long time and has not yet finished arriving, quantum physics. And we approach this territory carefully, not to borrow the authority of physics for claims that physics does not make, but to use its images as the tradition of deep meaning has always used them. Describes a universe in which particles that have once interacted remain correlated across any distance. The technical name for this is quantum entanglement, and the colloquial description, which Einstein offered with the mixture of accuracy and unease that characterized his relationship with this aspect of the theory he helped create, was spooky action at a distance. What quantum entanglement demonstrates is that the universe does not always behave as if distance separates things. That connection, once established, is not easily lost. That what was once part of the same whole retains, at some level, its wholeness. We are made of the universe. Every atom in your body was forged in the interior of a star that no longer exists, dispersed by that star's death, across the space that eventually condensed into the solar system, incorporated into the geological and biological processes of this planet, cycled through the bodies of organisms across billions of years before arriving. Now, in the particular temporary configuration that is you. You are not separate from the universe. You are one of the ways the universe is happening right now, in this place, thinking these thoughts, feeling whatever you feel in the dark behind your closed eyes. If that is true, and the physics does not contradict it, then the question of whether we belong here resolves, at one level, into something almost laughably simple. We are here, made entirely of here, and the belonging is not something to be achieved. It is the ground condition of existence itself. And yet, and this is where the question refuses to be simple, the consciousness that is aware of belonging is also aware of something that exceeds belonging. It is aware of the distance between what it is and what the world around it is. It is aware of the silence between the stars. It is aware of the questions that the stars do not answer. Perhaps belonging and longing are not opposites. Perhaps they are the same experience from different vantage points. The body belongs, without question, to the chemical and biological world it is part of, and the consciousness that rides the body reaches, without rest, towards something that the body's world does not contain, not because it is absent from this world, but because it is the world's own deepest nature, the mystery inside the fact, the awareness inside the matter, and that nature cannot be grasped from within the system it underlies, can only be circled, approximated, touched briefly in music and in mathematics and in the particular silence that follows a question held long enough to stop expecting an answer. Your blood is a record. Whatever its type, whatever its history, whatever ancient crossing, or ancient isolation, or ancient adaptation gave it its present form, it is a record of everything that had to happen, in exactly the sequence it happened, for you to be here right now. The protein that some people have, and some people do not. The deletion that occurred somewhere in an African population 100,000 years before writing was invented. The migrations and isolations and encounters and mixings and separations that carried that deletion across the world and concentrated it in one language and one mountain range and one sea-facing coast. All of that is in the blood. All of that is in the cells. And the consciousness that contemplates the blood, that looks at the molecular fact of its own existence and asks why and how and whether this is home. That consciousness is the most remarkable thing in the record. More remarkable than the protein, more remarkable than the deletion, more remarkable than the language that has no relatives. The fact that matter can become aware of itself, can turn back on its own history and ask what it is and where it came from, and whether the distance it feels is a wound or a gift. That fact is the deepest mystery of all, and it is present tonight in every one of us, regardless of what the surface of our red blood cells carries. There is a concept in the contemplative traditions that has no precise equivalent in the vocabulary of modern science. But that points towards something science is also, in its own way, circling. The idea of the witness. The witness is what remains when you subtract from consciousness everything that it is aware of. Every sensation, every thought, every memory, every emotion, every narrative about who you are and where you came from. The witness is the awareness itself, prior to its contents, prior to the self that those contents construct. Every tradition that has investigated the interior life deeply enough has arrived at something like this. That beneath the noise of personality and history and biology and belief, there is a stillness that is not the absence of experience, but its ground. Not emptiness, not nothing, but a fullness so complete that it has no shape, because all shapes arise within it. The question of R's negative blood, held long enough and gently enough, leads here. Not because the blood is spiritually significant in any way that can be demonstrated. It is not, as far as science can determine, connected to any measurable difference in consciousness, perception, or experience. But because the act of sitting with an unexplained mystery and refusing to resolve it prematurely, refusing to close the question before it has given up what it actually contains, is itself a practice. It is the practice of remaining present with the unknown, of being willing to not know, of trusting that the mystery is not a failure of understanding, but an invitation toward a deeper kind of understanding. One that includes the body, the history, the inheritance we carry without having chosen it. The immunologist and writer Lewis Thomas, a man who spent his professional life at the intersection of biology and the philosophy of what it means to be alive, wrote near the end of his life that the greatest of all the accomplishments of 20th century science has been the discovery of human ignorance. And he meant it as a celebration, because the more we know, he observed, the more precisely we can describe what we do not know, and the more beautiful the contour of our ignorance becomes. The R-negative mystery is a beautiful contour of ignorance, precise, persistent, biologically real, distributed across the world in a pattern that implies a story we have not yet been able to tell, pointing toward a function we have not yet been able to name, connecting to an ancient human question about origin and belonging. Through a chain of image and intuition and improbable correspondence that is not nothing, even if it is not proof. We are, all of us, carrying mysteries in our blood tonight. Not just the 6% who lack a particular protein, but all of us, carrying the record of every event that had to happen, in exactly the sequence it happened, over 4 billion years of biological history for us to be here, carrying the memory of every ancestor who survived long enough to reproduce, which means every ancestor who navigated, with whatever resources they had available to them, the full difficulty of being alive in a world that was not designed for their convenience, carrying the compressed record of extinctions and migrations and ice ages and warm periods and catastrophes so complete that they left almost no survivors, and the survivors carried on anyway, carrying their mystery into whatever came next. We are near the end of tonight's journey, and the night is deep, and the questions we have opened will not be closed before morning. This is not a failure. The questions that cannot be closed before morning are the only ones worth traveling this far to find. Everything else is housekeeping. Consider for a moment the strange double nature of the human situation, which the Rh-negative mystery illuminates from an unusual angle. On one hand, we are biological organisms, carbon and water and electrical impulses, and the biochemical legacy of organisms that have been solving the problem of survival since long before any of our ancestors had spines. We are, in this sense, thoroughly of the earth, made from its minerals, powered by its sun, dependent on its ecosystems, scheduled for its decomposition. The body does not belong to us so much as we belong to it. We are, from one angle, the body's most elaborate strategy for continuing to exist. And on the other hand, there is the awareness. The thing that is reading these words, or rather, the thing that is listening to these words in the dark, behind your closed eyes, the thing that notices the sensation of breath and the quality of the silence and the particular texture of tiredness that good thinking produces. That awareness is not obviously a thing that belongs to the world it observes. It is inside the world, clearly, housed in the body, dependent on the brain, subject to everything that the body is subject to. And yet, it has a quality of distance from all of that, a capacity to step back and observe even itself. That is very hard to account for if consciousness is simply what the brain does. The ancient traditions understood this double nature not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be inhabited. You are both, they said, the body and the awareness, the earth and the sky. You are the animal that is afraid and the light that is not afraid, and the meeting between them. And the tension in that meeting is not a malfunction. It is the engine of everything human and interesting and worth having happened, the art and the science, and the music and the questions asked at 3 a.m. All of it comes from the gap, from the distance between what we are and what we know ourselves to be, from the inability to fully belong to either world while carrying both. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, writing in the 17th century with a precision that has not dated, described the human being as a thinking reed, the most fragile thing in nature, crushable by a drop of water, and yet able to encompass the universe in thought, to know its own finitude, to know that the stars do not know it exists. The greatness of humanity, he said, consists in knowing its misery. A tree does not know it is miserable. To know one is miserable is to know something that the rest of nature, so far as we can determine, does not know. The Rh negative mystery is, among other things, a peculiarly specific instance of this larger strangeness. The capacity of matter to look at itself and find itself puzzling. There is a practice in some contemplative traditions, particularly in certain schools of Zen Buddhism and in the Sufi tradition of Islam, of sitting with a question not in order to answer it, but in order to be changed by it. The question is not a problem to be solved, but a teacher whose teaching is not information, but transformation. Something in the quality of attention that the unanswerable question requires, held long enough and honestly enough, opens the person who holds it into a different relationship with reality. They do not emerge knowing more so much as knowing differently, carrying the question more lightly, and carrying themselves more lightly alongside it. Tonight, we have been sitting with a question that has been waiting for a long time for someone to sit with it honestly, not to explain it away with a quick answer, not to sensationalize it into something it may not be, not to dismiss it because it is inconvenient, or inflate it because it is exciting, just to sit with it. The question of whether we belong here. The question of what the blood remembers that the mind has forgotten. The question of what an unexplained absence in the molecular text of 6% of humanity might mean, might be the trace of, might point toward, if we were willing to hold it long enough for it to speak in its own time. We do not have the answer. The researchers do not have the answer. The ancient texts have images, not answers. The caves have paintings, not answers. The mountains have silence, and the silence is not nothing. But neither is it an answer in any form that can be written down. What we have, at the end of this particular journey, is something quieter than an answer and more durable. We have the shape of the question. We have its texture and its weight and its particular quality of insistence. We have the sense, which may itself be a kind of knowing, that the question matters, that it has mattered to every generation that has encountered it. From the scribes who wrote the 6th chapter of Genesis to the geneticists who published their puzzled papers in the journals of the early 21st century, to the people who feel, in the particular silence of their own interior life, that they are carrying something they have not yet been given the language to describe. Language will catch up. It always does eventually, because the universe is patient and the blood is patient and the questions are patient. They have been waiting much longer than any of us have been asking them. And they will wait much longer still, growing richer and stranger and more beautiful in their waiting, like those painted horses on the cave wall in the Dordogne, waiting in the dark for 36,000 years for someone to bring a light. What remains, as the mind begins to release its grip on the particular and float toward the general, toward the warm, dark, formless place where sleep begins, is something quieter than a conclusion, an image, a recognition, a settling. You are ancient, not in the metaphorical sense in which everyone is ancient, though that too is true, and deserves its own night. You are ancient in the specific sense that the biological patterns you carry are genuinely old, that the cells moving through your body were built from templates that have been refining themselves for hundreds of millions of years, that the deepest structures of your biology predate not just your grandparents and your country and your civilization, but the genus, the family, the order of living things you belong to. You are, from the inside, a contemporary experience. From the outside, seen from the right distance, you are a temporary expression of a process that has been going on since before the oceans had their current chemistry. The Rh- mystery is one thread in this fabric, a thread that is visible, that draws the eye, that has a particular color and a particular texture and a particular insistence. But the fabric itself is vast beyond comprehension. The mystery is not located in the thread. The mystery is the fabric. The mystery is that any of this exists at all, that there is something rather than nothing, that the something includes consciousness, that the consciousness includes the capacity to wonder about its own origin, that the wondering feels, at its most honest, like remembering. There is a word in the Basque language, the untranslatable language that has carried an untranslatable blood through the centuries at the edge of the known world, that expresses the concept of a sacred place in nature, a place where the human and the wild and the divine briefly overlap and become difficult to distinguish from one another. The Basques, who have been living at the edge of things for longer than any European civilization can trace itself, have always known that the edge is where things are most clearly seen, that what is hardest to explain is often the most worth explaining, that the questions that have no answers are not the empty ones, but the full ones, so full that no answer could contain them. Your blood is carrying you tonight. It has always been carrying you, without your permission and without your attention, through the hours when you were not thinking about it. It will continue to carry you into tomorrow, into the mornings that follow this dark one, into whatever the next chapter of your particular ancient story turns out to be. It does not need you to understand it. It asks only that you rest. Let the question settle now, layer by layer, like the slow accumulation of sediment in deep and very still water. Each question finding its own depth, each unanswered thing resting in its own unansweredness, not as a failure, but as a placeholder for something that is still approaching, still being assembled in the dark, still on its way toward the language that will finally be adequate to it. The sapra says, night holds you, and the question holds you, and the ancient, patient, mysterious fact of your existence holds you. There is nothing to understand right now. There is only this. Breathing, dark, the old blood moving through its ancient roots, carrying its old record through the corridors of one more night. On one more turn of one more planet, orbiting one ordinary star at the edge of one of 2 trillion galaxies in a universe whose edges have not been found. You are here, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep well.